Hello, everybody, and welcome to Threatpost's live webinar titled Retail Security, Magecart, and the Rise of E-Commerce Threats. I'm Becky Bracken, and I will be your host for today's presentation. Today, we've gathered a world-class panel of security experts who will discuss surges and threats online to retailers, and we're thrilled to have them join us. Just as a quick reminder, there's a widget in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. There you can submit questions at any time throughout the presentation. Please do so. We love to get questions, and we'll have time at the end to go through those and answer as many as we can. The pandemic, as we all know, has created a bit of a perfect storm for retail security breaches of all kinds. It's drastically accelerated the shift from shopping in a store to making even the most mundane purchases online. And I think pretty much once we were all on eBay bidding on rolls of toilet paper, all the sense flew out the window of us not being able to buy everyday stuff online. In fact, new customer accounts make up 30% of current transactions online, which is 5 times higher than pre-COVID, which is according to Forder's recent fraud attack index. Retailers have also had to cobble together, entirely new chains of business. They've moved away from in-person to contactless transactions like delivery, and there's new models of buy online, pick up in store. But because they're new, they're a pretty plum pick for clever crooks trying to find a new hustle. And now we're headed into the holiday shopping season, which will add an entirely new level of chaos. Fraudsters love to use the cover of a spike in traffic for their crimes. More transactions mean more security is bogged down, and teams get overloaded with traffic surges and increased volume, which leaves them exposed. It's a new world for retailers, and we've brought together our panelists to sort it out and to talk about the trends that they're seeing. But before we do that, we want to have a poll of our attendees. Please take the time to take it. It should pop up here on your screen momentarily. The question is, which e-commerce threat concerns you most? It's a fairly broad question, but we hope that it'll help us kind of guide our coverage both today and ongoing about the things that are keeping you up at night. So just take a couple of seconds and please respond. And then we'll go over those results at the end of the presentation as well. Okay, I'm going to close that poll, and we will talk about that later. Which brings us to our panelists. First, we'd like to welcome Robert Capps, and he's New Data's VP of Marketplace Innovation. He's a respected industry expert, and he's got more than 25 years of experience in the sector. So welcome, Robert. Next, we have Alan Liska. He's an intelligence analyst for Recorded Future. He's a go-to media source and consultant to businesses on how to combat evolving threats. Finally, I'd like to introduce Matt Wilson. He leads product management for network and application security at Neustar, where he developed and maintains the largest DDoS mitigation network in the world. So I want to welcome all of you and thank you very much for being here. For the purposes of today's discussion, we've broken it down, the whole universe of exposure, into 3 vectors: external threats, threats from the network view, and threats from the internal view. First, we're going to have Alan discuss the retail security landscape as a whole and highlight a few of the most headline-making and prolific schemes. So, Alan, if you'd like to take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for kicking us off, and thank you everyone for attending today. Appreciate everyone's time. So I want to start with what we're looking at in terms of the biggest attacks that we're seeing against e-commerce and retail sites over the last 6 months. So the big sort of headline grabber, and the reason that it's in the title of the webinar today, is Magecart. Magecart has been hit, has hit a lot of major retailers, whether that's through actual vulnerabilities in the retail site, or whether it's through malvertising campaigns. There's been a whole lot of there's a whole lot of different groups behind Magecart, and there are a whole lot of different methods of attack, and unfortunately, they've been very prolific. The second thing is we're seeing a rise in DDoS attacks against e-commerce and retail sites. So we have Best Buy going offline because of it, AWS halting the largest DDoS attack ever recorded, GameStop getting hit with DDoS attacks, etc. So it seems like every major retailer has had a problem with DDoS, and we have now the problem of DDoS extortion, similar to ransomware, where the attacker threatens to DDoS unless you pay them, 100,000, 150,000 in Bitcoin. That being a problem. And then we also have the problem of retail and e-commerce sites being used as phishing lures. Now, that's been a problem for the largest brands. So Apple has been used, Amazon's been used, Yahoo and Netflix have been used as phishing lures. But we're seeing a change in the capabilities of these phishing lure campaigns, where the attackers are very adaptable to what's going on in the world, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to talk a little more about Magecart and what we're seeing there. So Magecart is used as an identifier for multiple threat actors. So it's not just one team behind Magecart. There are multiple of them. And basically what Magecart is a JavaScript-based card skimmer. So you load that up onto a website, you intercept somebody trying to buy something on the store, and you steal their credit card information. In 2015, Magecart was a single group. Since then, there are dozens of different groups that Recorded Future's been tracking, and they've hit thousands and thousands of websites. So right now, it's one of the biggest threats to e-commerce sites. We've seen, like in September, we saw over a weekend 2,000 sites get hit by the exploitation of a single vulnerability. And I wanted to show, this is a great graphic that I pulled from Security Affairs to show kind of how it works. What you have is you have an e-commerce site, and then one of the Magecart actors will get in either through an exploitation. So they use common exploitations, generally not using 0 days. They're using known vulnerabilities that have public exploits that have been out for a while. They'll exploit those to upload their code, or they'll do it through malvertising. So they'll buy advertising on certain websites through the banner ads, and they'll use that and load that in the banner ad itself. So basically what happens is the victim gets hit, their credit card and other information is stolen. The attacker then goes and uses that to buy merchandise and other things, goes to a merchandise mule, a shipper, goes to an Eastern European buyer, and the attacker winds up getting the money. It's a long, complicated process, but it's been very profitable for a lot of these attackers, and it's been relatively safe, except for the mules. It's been relatively safe as a means of attack without little detection. So while Magecart is one of the biggest threats, the other things that we want to focus on are the DDoS attacks and the phishing lures. So I'm going to let Matt, who's got way more information, talk about DDoS attacks. Just suffice to say, they are on the rise. They've taken out some of the larger sites, at least temporarily. And again, we're seeing a rise in retail or DDoS extortion, and we expect to continue to see more of that as it gets easier and easier to launch these DDoS attacks. Every time a botnet gets taken down, another one pops up, or it just reforms itself. And when we saw that this week with the TrickBot botnet, which is generally not used for DDoS attacks, but it was temporarily disrupted and immediately came right back online with backup infrastructure. So unfortunately, disrupting these botnets is at best a temporary solution. They continue to pop back up. But again, when we talk about retail organizations being increasingly used as phishing lures, one of the things we saw during the pandemic is a quick adaptation depending on what the current news stories were. So for the first time ever, we saw grocery stores being used as phishing lures. So you get an ad purported to come from a national grocery store chain, but in fact it was a phishing attack. Same thing with food delivery services. We saw a huge uptick in fake domains being registered, typo squad type domains being registered for like Deal Dash, Uber Eats, things like that. And we saw there was a very bad attempt we saw at to Terrace Point to get people to click on to buy toilet paper. So we saw even toilet paper companies get impersonated as part of these attacks. So as things continue to evolve, and especially heading into the season, while we normally expect luxury brands to be impersonated, so we see a lot of that with like Rolex and Porsche and Mercedes, etc. As phishing actors get more sophisticated, they're moving downstream and they're moving to very specific verticals that people aren't necessarily expecting to be used as phishing lures, and we expect that trend to continue. So unfortunately, it's something that's not going away.
Okay. Wow. All right. Next, Matt, we'll have him give us the network view and talk more about DDoS and phishing from the network perspective. Matt?
Yeah, hi everybody. So DDoS from really kind of falls into kind of two different aspects. Really, it's you think about it in two different ways. One is about protecting your infrastructure, and that's really the idea that you're, having a website that's up is actually, really critical, obviously, to having being able to sell during time. So, if your website's not up, everything else kind of doesn't matter from a retail perspective. So we've seen for years that DDoS has been used for a lot of different reasons. It's been used kind of in political ways, taking down political dissidents, taking out nation states. In the case of things like the invasion of Georgia and some other places, they saw a lot of DDoS attacks preempting that. You see a lot of what we would kind of colloquially call the script kiddie type of things, people just sort of angry at somebody wanting to take them offline. But then you've also seen a lot where you've had both anti-competitive type of threats where someone wants to take down a competition that might exist in another area. But increasingly, and kind of it's how in large part some of the business started, but also what it's come back to here recently is the idea of extortion attacks. We've seen a huge uptick in this. It never really went away. We've always had a lot of customers who have come under extortion attacks for a variety of reasons, but they tended to be, as Alan mentioned, they kind of tended to be in kind of specific industries. They were either kind of high profile brands, things like that. So increasingly, starting back in August, you started to see a lot more extortion attacks, and there was a big campaign about 3 different groups going after financial and travel, and they've kind of since morphed. And I think you've seen a transition. In this from just focusing on these kind of high profiles, large banks, things along those lines. They're now starting to go after kind of what would be traditionally less high profile, less lucrative types of businesses, going after healthcare, regional banks, insurance providers, even things like personal care products, people along those lines. So kind of as this has gone on, really it's started to evolve, and the threat landscape has really evolved, particularly in the last year. So we've seen kind of two real things happen. One is new people beginning to get threatened and attacked, and whether that's opportunity or they think that there's value there because these are people who aren't traditional types of targets, who might not be what you would consider to be high risk traditionally. So they may be less likely to have protection in place or have really things. So maybe they're a little more likely to pay out a ransomware. But then they've also sort of moved down the stack. And so you've seen things where instead of just trying to take down networks, I try to take down applications. And at the same time, what's kind of continuing is this idea that I don't just send one type of attack. For instance, some of these extortion attacks, there's about 6 or 7 different vectors that are commonly used as part of these attacks. And typically it's not one. They don't simply send one vector. They'll send multiple vectors. So having one type of protection really doesn't kind of work anymore. You need to be able to have the concept is this defense in depth. So it starts at the network, being able to absorb the big bandwidth attacks, whether that's yourself or working with a provider, being able to absorb the big bandwidth attacks. And that kind of leaves you, be able to put your resources to the more specific, kind of more targeted types of attacks on your end. So if you kind of move forward, like I said, this is what we've seen a lot of, is that DDoS attacks, as we mentioned, you've seen extortion attacks, you've seen them as part of phishing campaigns, with really the idea being that the DDoS attack is very much a diversionary tactic. They hit the news, they're big. We talk about things like, the largest attacks out there being in the 2 terabits per second type of range. And they're all really big ooh-ah types of numbers, and they're very scary looking. However, like, the real damage can come behind the scenes, and I sort of equate it to walking down the street and someone comes up and punches you in the face. Meanwhile, someone else is picking your pocket, while you're worried about your face. And that's very much what kind of where DDoS falls into that threat landscape. So increasingly, you need to be able to handle the large attacks, being able to deal with the large attacks. It's not, oftentimes it's not just a matter of, if you're going to be under an attack, it's when and how are you going to deal with it. So having something in place, having alternatives, having a plan is very important in that. And it gives you a few different things. One of the biggest parts of DDoS attack is simply limiting your attack surface. You have applications that are open to the web, being able to limit that down to only like kind of the ports and protocols and applications that are most important to you. Because a lot of times the attackers, if I can block them and prevent them hitting, the other types of services or the other things that I'm not using upstream, I can prevent them from hitting that and I can narrow it down. Well, they're not going to attack something that they can't reach because they can't reach it. So it's not effective. And so they'll move on to another target, the less effective it is. But then the other big thing is having the visibility. I can't tell you how often customers come to us and they really don't have any idea of what their actual traffic looks like, whether it's in terms of, bits per second or packets per second, or, even if you're talking about application layer transactions per second. What's normal for me? How many queries are coming in and hitting my web server? Having these types of numbers and having this type of visibility is very important to understand what's abnormal, what's different. So kind of moving forward at the application level, really it comes down to 2 things. People are putting a WAF in place. So you put WAFs in place basically to protect your application. There's 2 different ways of doing that protection. You have the negative security model. So as Alan mentioned, this is being able to protecting into the known bad. So when Magecart and other bad guys, if you will, are using kind of commonly available exploits, they're able to do that because people aren't patching, because people aren't paying attention and don't know that they're vulnerable to this. So having something like a WAF in place and kind of to a further extent, things like bot management, where you're trying to identify what is good and what is bad, and get rid of the very common stuff. So WAF is really good for that. You can get rid of known bad. Not everybody can patch. Not everybody even knows they need to patch. So being able to have a service upstream from you that can simply narrow down that threat landscape and that threat vector is actually very important. And so, that's one of the main drivers behind having something like a web app firewall in front of your applications, is in order to do that and to kind of keep this. And then also it can adapt, right? So as your application changes, as developers roll out new things, I can adjust what my settings are, and there's things to do, kind of automatic learning and relaxation rules. If I think it's alerting too much, it'll kind of automatically scale back or give me recommendations on that. And then sort of the next layer on top of that is this bot management. And so having bot management behind it is going to be able to say that trying to identify what is a legitimate user versus a not legitimate user. So as IP addresses or users or clients are coming to your website, being able to look at this and say, there's kind of like very basic bot, and then there's very, very advanced bot. And then Robert's going to get to this in a second on kind of really what that advanced bot landscape looks like. But these are the things that, the idea being that defense in depth, being able to narrow down what the threat is increasingly or decreasingly as it kind of continues to do, and being able to focus your resources on the threats that are not the very, very basic one, not the kind of the big ones, but the very detailed, fine-tuned ones. And so with that, I'll pass it to Robert.
Thanks, Matt. And just by way of introduction, Robert, he is going to talk about the internal operations, how this looks from inside, and provide some really interesting information on emerging threats. Go ahead, Robert.
Well,
thank you.
Thanks. So let me go one slide forward. Cool. So it's sort of an inside view out. One of the things we talk about here in regards to application layer threats is it does require a defense in depth strategy, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute. But one thing that most people don't quite understand is that about 1 in 3 interactions on your web applications or API endpoints today were malicious in the first half of 2020, and that's average. Some industries have much higher percentages of suspicious or bad traffic, and others much lower. In the financial area, financial institutions in general, most institutions are seeing about 10 bad logins for every 1 good one. So if you think about the impact that's having on your business, from the infrastructure that's required to manage those bad transactions, whether they are servers, licensing, room in the data center, additional virtual machines in the cloud, however you service it, plus the staff required to manage all that. For every 1 good customer login, you've got 10 bad ones that are occurring, trying to test credentials that have been stolen through phishing or malware or intrusion or what have you. And of those attack volumes, 1.4% of them are going to be good. So if you think about 1 million credentials being verified, which is a small number these days with the data breaches that are out there, 1.4% of those 1 million attempts will be good customer credentials that work on your website. And if you think about your fraud teams, you think about your operations, how would you manage resetting those customers? How would you manage understanding the true impact that credential verification attack and ATO attack is going to have on your business? And as we've talked about now, has come up a couple times in the presentation, automated bot activity against financial institutions is huge. But what's even bigger is 96% of what we're seeing now is advanced human emulating techniques in order to evade detection. And this is after we've seen all of the other fraud tools, the other protections in the infrastructure protect the login page. And if you think about, you've got your WAFs out there, you've got your CDN, content distribution networks, you've got all these different organizations and different products and services that are out there trying to avoid that very basic automation. And most of the fraudsters are now moving into the advanced human emulating. So let's go into the next slide and talk a little bit about what that means. So there's been this huge evolution over time. You know, when we had good humans logging in, you typically saw them coming from similar IPs each time and a low volume of transactions. Reputations for those IPs were generally good. There wasn't a history of fraud or anything else involved. Device IDs were definitely being generated, and often they linked back to the same consumer time and time again, so you had good reputation to rely upon. When those humans loaded up your login page or a page in your application, that page rendered in a browser. And you know, and the scripts that are associated with it, the graphics, they all loaded, they executed as well, and information is collected and generated. And there's a real sort of a consumer interaction that occurs at that point. Now, when the customer starts navigating around a site, they're doing so in a way that is appropriate for a human. They don't necessarily have millisecond delays between page loads. They are just, you know, they load the page, they look at the page, they look for the right button to push to go to the next step. And when we look at input velocity, we see mouse movement. We see keystroke input that is very human-like. You know, it's not 10 milliseconds per keystroke entering, or the data is not being posted into the entire page all at once. You're seeing, you know, what would be normal for moving your hand from, say, if you wanted to type my name from the R to the O to the B to the E to RT. There's a dwell time between those keystrokes that looks human-like. And all the data matched. When you look at the endpoint, the client data that's submitted versus what the server is observing on the network, everything seems to line up. And in the situation where you needed to intervene in a transaction, where you needed to send something as simple as a CAPTCHA or as advanced as a two-factor challenge, those humans are able to solve those. And then we saw automation, right? And so when we talk about basic bot activity, we're seeing, you know, high volumes of transactions coming from an IP, a given IP or IP range. You're seeing the reputation of those IPs being poor because they're sending a lot of bad login transactions, or they're you know, hitting you with a whole lot of volume. They're not generating device IDs. There's no actual client present. It's a script sitting on a server somewhere that's just sending transaction post after transaction post. And of course, because they're doing that, there's no rendering and no completion of any content that's on page. Good news is that basic bots really don't have the ability to complete interventions or challenges. And so many of those, even things simple like CAPTCHAs, can still be very effective against these basic automated techniques. And then we get into advanced bots. So this is the evolution of threat. After organizations deployed things like web application firewalls and content distribution networks and throttling, and even infrastructure within their own data centers to stop automation, basic automation, we've seen that the authors of the scripts that are using or that are providing automation technologies are starting to make their products more intelligent. They rotate through a much lower number of IP addresses. Lower number of transactions per IP address. Those IP reputations tend to be good. They tend to be seeded out into home cable modems and DSL networks and such like that, and even wireless connections versus coming from the cloud or a data center. They're creating device IDs, valid device IDs, though they have no reputation. They look like new devices. They're rendering pages, probably using a headless browser or headless engine for automation. They're loading scripts, they're executing the scripts, the normal interactions happen. But here's where it gets really interesting. They still can manage things like human-like navigational velocity and input, but computers are still very hard at emulating human behavior. Either they're going to follow a script and use the similar timings every single time they go from page to page, or they're going to introduce randomness into those interactions. So some interactions may be 20 milliseconds, some may be 80 milliseconds. But what's going to happen is, as you observe real human behaviors, you're going to see very standardized sets of data. You know, human interactions tend to line up in regards to how fast people type, how fast people navigate. But randomization of data stands out very, very clearly against those human patterns. And so even these advanced technologies are being caught up in automation detection techniques, and they still can't deal with interventions. And so what we've seen now is a move to a hybrid. a blending of human and automation. The automation takes the heavy lifting of sending all the transactions, and when those transactions are intercepted by anti-bot technology or by other fraud or risk systems, those interventions that are served up to those transactions are sent to another human somewhere else on the planet. In fact, we saw a boutique financial institution firm where they were seeing 100,000+ transactions a day that exhibited this exact pattern of good looking transactions at the surface, but some randomized data and randomized weight, states, and times that resulted in an intervention on most of those transactions. And they re-rendered those interventions on a computer somewhere else in the world that had additional data associated with it that we could identify was not the original device. And so that got to be a very, very interesting technique, because it showed a continued evolution of the attackers to find ways around our cybersecurity and other anti-fraud solutions that are in place across the industry.
Okay.
I think that's where we're going to end up on this one.
Yeah, okay. Well, now we've got an excellent view of the landscape as it is. And I think this is a good time to turn to our poll and see where our attendees, where their stress is. It was kind of an interesting mix. 6% of you are concerned about DDoS attacks and presence of automation. 19% are concerned about advanced persistent threats. 25% are concerned about data breaches, but 44% of you are worried about Magecart. And so let's maybe take a minute to go around with our panelists and maybe talk a little bit more about where Magecart attacks are first visible, and early mitigation, and what will early alert retailers quickly that they are under attack from a Magecart scam. Can we start with Alan on that?
Sure. So, we've mentioned the WAFA a few times, and I think that's one of the big things that part of that layered protection is that sort of that edge, understanding what attackers are coming after you. But I think even before that, and this is boring, but I say this all the time, and in 25 years in the industry, we still haven't gotten it right. Vulnerability management's a big thing for protecting against Magecart. You need to know what vulnerabilities you have exposed on your e-commerce site, on your retail site, and you need to make sure you're patching those regularly, especially as we get closer to the holiday, and a lot of sites shut down and don't want to allow code updates, etc. You need to make sure everything's fully patched. So again, part of that layered protection, start by good vulnerability management. You want to have rules in place on your WAF that's looking for this kind of activity. Certainly, you want to be alerted if there's any known activity coming out of your e-commerce site, and then ways of scanning for any ads that may be on your site, looking for things, malicious code that's embedded in the ads themselves. That's kind of a way to start, again, from the outside view. I'm sure the other panelists will have some better ideas for how to better protect internally.
Okay, so patching vulnerability. What do we think, Matt? What are we doing from an application network perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, I would double down on the vulnerability patching. Like, obviously, that's kind of where a lot of this stuff starts, is having a site that isn't up to date, and not everybody can patch, right? Like, not everybody's able to. If it's kind of some legacy code, there's still legacy code written in the 60s still out in the industries and places, simply because it can't be patched, it can't be updated. And you're going to break a lot of things if you do it. So hopefully people aren't quite that extreme. We're not running things on 40-year-old code, but even then, as applications become more and more complex, your ability just to go and make changes and to fully QA and fully test all the follow-on kind of problems, can be problematic. And so, kind of double down on the WAF side of things. It's important. I'd also say just simply having a good visibility into your platform, understanding what traffic's normal, when it goes abnormal, and whether that's not even just from the DDoS perspective, just from what queries are coming in, what sort of, what is, if there's posts on your site, what does that post look like? What is the application doing behind the scenes, and having kind of metrics internally that you can use to monitor that and identify what is looking like, not even necessarily malicious behavior, but aberrant behavior. Because a lot of times,
what is our normal?
Yeah, exactly. Understanding normal and being able to identify what is abnormal.
Okay, so but backing up to the patching, we got a really good question on this, and I want to get this in here while we're on the topic. Chris Brown mentioned you can only patch what you control. Most Magecart attacks are conducted by compromising third parties. You can't patch code you don't own. Good point. What do we say to that?
Be careful what code you deploy on your website. So, a lot of what's going on here is that libraries, free libraries, plugins that are available in some of these e-commerce platforms have questionable security practices, or maybe haven't been vetted in a period of time since they were deployed, and new vulnerabilities are found. We just need to find a way, as a retailer, you have to find a way to understand how to protect your site, and you have to be responsible for making sure you have the right products and services out there, minimizing the number of things that you employ so you have fewer things to review. I've been on the small merchant side where you want to use all the greatest technology out there to to make your storefront look good, but it becomes a nightmare to manage. And so simplicity is best, and be careful with the technology you deploy. Just because it's available doesn't mean it's safe for your customers.
Mm-hmm. What about Alan or Matt? Did you have anything else to add to that?
No, I mean,
Yeah, I think one of the things that I tell people is that that's absolutely true, especially if you're using a lot of third-party code and so on your site. But you, as the organization that's contracting with that third party, do have the ability to say, hey, what are your review process? Understand the review process. Make sure they actually are reviewing the code, and if not, look for alternatives that you have more faith in their ability to actually review the code and so on. I think that's kind of a big part of it, and yet it puts a lot more work on you. Unfortunately, if there is a compromise on your site, your customers aren't necessarily going to want to hear, well, it was third-party code, there wasn't anything we can do about it. Yeah, they're going to want to know, they're going to want answers from you about how you're going to fix it.
We had one other question, and although we try to be agnostic here, Joshua Jones is looking for recommendations for client-side prevention technology for Magecart. Can you guys give us an idea of what we should be looking for, and any recommendations you have on that? No? Okay.
Matt, does Newstar do Magecart prevention?
Not on the client side, no, we don't.
Okay.
So can you guys think of anybody that's doing client-side Magecart prevention?
No, I mean, like vendors like F5 also are on the network side. I'm trying to think of.
Chris Brown mentioned the name Source Defense. Does that?
I'm not familiar with them. They may very well be. I'm not familiar with them. Robert, are you familiar with them at all?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll circle back and see if we can get some more answers for Joshua here down the line. Moving on, our second most terrifying threat were data breaches for our audience. So maybe we can go around and talk specifically about data breaches and beyond the patching and the normal sort of hygiene stuff. What should retailers be looking out for? Let's start with Robert. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So when it comes to data breach, we have to recognize that most consumer data has been breached in some way, shape, or form, and the cyber criminals have assembled a lot of this data together in larger data sets that are the sum of the parts of many breaches. And so everything we're doing from a retail perspective, everything we're doing from a financial services perspective to manage the security of consumers needs to be with a lens of most of this data has already been compromised. So when we look at things like two-factor authentication, when we look at things like how do you authenticate a new user, you have to come from a perspective of what can I do to effectively protect this transaction that's coming to be, so that only the good legitimate consumer is the one that can take this action. And that's that whole defense in depth strategy. Again, it's not just dealing with the stolen data, but also going to the top of the funnel and dealing with how it's used and how it's validated. ATO, account takeover attacks, are a real problem for all industries right now, because the cyber criminals have figured out that username and password data stolen from one website is useful broadly across many, many, many different organizations, because consumers are notoriously bad at maintaining individual usernames and passwords for each site they interact with. And it's just, yeah, I mean, it's just a huge problem of use of that data. And so anything we can do to minimize the usefulness of stolen data will directly impact the number of breaches and the scale of breaches, because data that is useless, well, no one's going to bother to steal. And so, so we need to focus on how do we operate in the face of massive data breach, and that's probably got to be, that has to be the design criteria for a lot of the new techniques and such that are going to consumers.
Just operate with the assumption that this is happening, and
Yep.
Got it. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I think along the same lines, it's you have to be able to trust but verify. Understanding that driving your consumers to have good passwords. If they've not logged in for a while, or if they've been part of a breach, you could potentially ask them to reset, things along those lines. As Robert said, that's people are really bad at reusing the exact same password everywhere, because it's easy to remember. So, but trying to drive that, but then, even once they're in the network, being able to, use other data, use threat intelligence, things along those lines to try to, identify what is the reputation of that user, what's the reputation of that device, are things kind of mapping together between, the credit card has this address, they're trying to ship to this address. A lot of these things should be raising red flags with folks, and putting things, consumers through some additional background checks on just to validate that things are right, and that this isn't becoming a fraudulent sort of login or fraudulent transaction.
Okay, well, Alan, what are you seeing as some best practice suggestions?
So I think that I think that both Matt and Robert hit on the big ones. We really need to look at making sure that is as painful as it often is for consumers who don't like it, making sure that everybody has unique password, that they're not reusing passwords. There are a lot of really good plugins that retailers can use to check to make sure that they're not allowing somebody to log in with or create an account with compromised credentials. And I realize that you run the risk by making it more difficult for them to create an account that they just won't buy from you, but ultimately you're doing it for their safety. User behavior analytics has become much more popular inside of corporate networks. Some of those same principles can apply to e-commerce and retail sites, so that's a big thing. The other thing is we're seeing a big uptick in loyalty card dumps on dark web. It turns out that there's some value in those. So if you are a brand that has loyalty cards, monitoring for large dumps of your loyalty cards on dark websites,
what are they using it for? Are they mapping it for purchase?
A lot of times, yes. So, I mean, if you think about it, like airline loyalty points are worth a
Exactly.
ton of money. I mean, I haven't traveled
Oh, okay.
anywhere for a while, but I've got a whole lot of United points that if somebody were to get a hold of and get the rest of my identity to match it up with, they could convert it to product or, take some trips or whatever. So that can be valuable. We see that with again with a lot of grocery stores where they're now taking those points and they're using it not just for free gas, but actual merchandise or gift cards or whatever. So those points can wind up being can wind up being valuable, especially if they can be converted to other things that are easily transferable. Across different underground marketplaces.
Yeah, loyalty programs are actually a source of a lot of automated activity as well. We had a client that had the ability for you to take your receipt home and sign up for the loyalty program and have that receipt applied to your account based on a random IDs at the bottom of the receipt. And those random IDs weren't random. Someone figured out the checksum and started running tens of thousands, millions of these receipt combinations through an automated checker to add the residual value that was unclaimed on those transactions to a given set of rewards accounts. And they were buying product and fulfilling eBay, Amazon, and other online order systems. They were fulfilling sold product on those systems with products that were purchased using reward points that were harvested using automation. And so you really have to look at these rewards programs as a source of potential loss of value in your organization. Because in a lot of cases, there millions of dollars could be going out the door, and the marketing teams are all cheering it on because they see so much success in that program.
Yeah. Well, I think the takeaway is here is never underestimate the creativity of criminals. I think they're pretty good at that. All right. Well, I think that's about all we have time for today. I want to thank our panelists again, Alan, Robert, and Matt. You guys gave us some great information on some pretty breaking stuff and stuff that's important for a growing number of retailers. But I also want to thank our attendees for taking the time to spend a little time with us and learn about retail e-commerce security. I just want to remind everyone that a transcript of today's event is going to be sent to your inbox so you can review it or send it along. And in the meantime, please check out Threatpost's archive of former webinars. It's a great source of information. And also, please come back and check out our daily coverage. So with that, I want to thank you all, and we'll talk soon. All righty. Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.